Brad Balukjian is a doctor, but not one who can write you a prescription unless you're a sick insect. He hated school when he was little, but now loves it so much that after graduating from the 23rd grade, he has moved to the other side of the desk to teach natural history at Merritt College in Oakland, California. He has strong opinions about the value of education, exposure to nature, and utility infielders from the 1980s, and is pursuing a hybrid career of teaching, writing, and research to get the word out that science is accessible and fun. He chose the path because he never wants to stop learning and apparently has a strong aversion to money. Brad, a Filipino-American, studied journalism and island biogeography, yes, that's a thing, at Duke University and earned his PhD in environmental science from UC Berkeley. In 2020, his first book, The Wax Pack, well, we can't really see it there, reached number 7 on the Los Angeles Times bestseller list and was named one of NPR's best books of the year. He primarily focuses on science and travel journalism. And please join me in welcoming Brad Balukjian. Take it away, Brad.
Thank you so much, Jeff, and thanks everyone for joining us tonight. I'll hold up the book here. I'll put it on the screen as well in a minute when I share my screen. But I want to start by having all of you think about who your childhood heroes were and why, and what it would be like to meet them when you were a kid, or what it would be like to meet them as an adult. And as we go through this little journey talk together, I want you to just keep thinking about that. And maybe at the end, you can share with me who some of your heroes were. So I was telling Jeff before that I love talking to library audience because you are invariably intellectually curious people who are just as interested, I think, in the larger context and the story behind books as the content of the books themselves. And so I'm going to give you some of that tonight in my presentation. I also want to give you a little bit of my backstory because I think it's relevant. I think the same way that the crux of my book is about who are the people behind the baseball cards, the baseball players. You know, it's also when you meet an author or you meet a creative type, you have the question of, well, who is the person behind the product, the creation that they're sharing with you. So I think it is, I know as a listener myself, it's always interesting to hear something about the people that were speaking to me. And I'm going to start at the end now by just saying that, you know, we're in 2021. My book, The Wax Pack, has been out for over a year. And as Jeff said, it's despite having kind of the same lifespan or trajectory as COVID, it came out in April of last year. It's been nice that it has done well since it came out. But I want to kind of start at the end and then take us back to the beginning of this book and where it came from and its origin stories. And I'll tell you that the overall, just to give you, if you're not familiar with the book, the premise is pretty simple. I got a pack of, just like this, one of these, a pack of 1986 baseball cards. And I said, whoever's inside that pack of cards, I'm going to track them down now and tell the story of what happens to baseball players after they're done playing, and go on a giant journey to find all these guys. So I actually took a road trip in 2015 where I drove 11,341 miles through 30 states in 49 days to find all of these guys. And the book is really the story of that journey, that road trip, and both me and the players that I was writing about. But I want to start by kind of taking you back to the beginning of this when I conceived of the book. And back in 2014, I was a year out of finishing my PhD and 34 years old, single, never married, no kids, and teaching part-time at a community college in Oakland, and very much just kind of scraping by, you know, making $30,000 a year, which in the Bay Area is not going to get you very far. So I was renting a room in a house here in Oakland. And I well, let me just share my screen here. So I've got some slides. So here's the book. Here's the book as it turned out, the cover. They did a great job of designing it to look exactly like the pack of 86 tops that the book is based on. And when I first had this idea of writing a book around a pack of baseball cards, it actually reminded me a lot of the experience I had just gone through in graduate school. And this may seem like a bit of a stretch, but I want you to bear with me for a second, that one of the points that I want to make in this talk is that there's actually a lot more in common with science and journalism than you may have ever realized. And as Jeff was saying in the intro, I'm a scientist and also a journalist. And I spent grad school getting a PhD in entomology, and never would have thought at the time that that process of studying insects would have actually been great preparation for writing a book about studying old baseball players. And so when the parallel between science and journalism is that in both cases, you start with some question or you want to solve some problem, and you figure out a way to collect data to try to answer that question or to solve that problem. Then you analyze those data and you come to some conclusion based on the evidence that hopefully solves your problem or addresses your question. And in the case of my book, the question was simply, what happens to these players after baseball? And the data was actually going and finding all these players and interviewing them and talking to them. And then, the book itself is just 5% of all the data I gathered, but it's the most salient data. And I would argue that in life, in doing science and journalism, there are two ways you can go about the enterprise of science or journalism. And the first is what I would call a higher risk approach, which is what I would call a discovery-driven approach, which means you don't really know necessarily ahead of time what exactly it is that you're looking for. And the second approach is we might call hypothesis-driven, which is where you've already got some baseline observations and you're setting out to test a very specific hypothesis that you have to address that question. And my story here, the story of my book, and the story of my PhD, and the story of my whole career, really, my whole life, is taking the first approach. And I would say that my story is an endorsement in your life for taking the riskier road, taking the discovery-driven approach, which is to say that when you take that approach, you'll meet more resistance. You'll meet more people saying, "I don't know if you can do that," and there was too many unknowns. But the payoff, I think, can be even greater when you're willing to take those risks. So, to give you some background for sort of how I ended up doing this book, when I was in graduate school, I came to graduate school and started at UC Berkeley in 2006. And I knew that I wanted to study insects, and I wanted to study insects that lived on islands, specifically the islands in French Polynesia, which is better known as Tahiti. And I came to my advisor like the first month of school and said, I really want to study these bugs. And I'm going to show you now what these bugs look like. They're called Tahitian plant bugs. And they're very colorful, all these different greens, yellows, and reds. And I had read in a really obscure report that someone had found these bugs on these remote islands and had no idea what they were. And that in and of itself was enough to get me hooked. Like just the fact that, wow, like we don't even know what these species are, to me was worthy of doing a PhD. And, my advisors, no, do something, more safe, do something that you have more baseline information about. And sure enough, my classmates who studied, climate change and who studied systems where things were already well known, finished their PhD in 5 years, and it took me 7, and they were funded a lot better than I was. But didn't matter, because to me, I was so passionate about just the spirit of discovery that even though it was a harder road, I said, no, this is what I want to do, is I want to study these insects. And so I persevered, I pushed through, I ended up discovering 17 species of insects that only live in Tahiti, doing all this taxonomy. And it was the discovery approach, it was the road less traveled that took me there. So when I finished my PhD and I wanted to go back into writing, I found myself with a whole new set of study subjects. Now, instead of insects, I had 14 baseball players. And like I said earlier, the premise of this book was to take a single pack and track down all the guys inside and tell the story of what happens to them. And you could write a lot of different types of books with that conceit. You could write a very straightforward account of these players' careers. You could take this in any number of directions. But for me, this book became something that was very personal. And that dates back to, when I was a kid. And here's my first baseball card, my T-ball card at age probably 6 in Rhode Island. And when I was around that age, I, like so many millions of other kids of that era, collected thousands of baseball cards by going down to the store and buying these, what they call wax packs of cards. And I, as a kid, I was definitely unusual in that my favorite players were actually the underdogs, so that not the star players. I collected the cards that were, not the most valuable. And I think the reason why I liked the underdog so much was because I felt I identified with them as an underdog myself, and having been picked on and bullied a lot in junior high, and I was really buck teeth and a stutter and really scrawny and all these things. And so I think in a way I felt this kinship with the baseball players who were not the biggest stars. So fast forward from me at that age to back to 2014, and here is the Oakland Coliseum, which is where the Oakland A's play. And here is me sitting in the upper deck up there by myself. So the Oakland Coliseum, even before COVID, looked like this. You could pay $15 and have an entire section to yourself. And if you read the book, you'll see that this isn't literally the day that I had the idea for the book, but there's a scene early in the book where I talk about getting inspired by sitting up there and watching a game and realizing that I no longer knew the baseball players anymore like I did as a kid, and when I had all those cards. And it got me thinking about wondering what happened to those guys that I grew up with. And then I had the idea of this, the single pack of cards that we used to buy as kids is a perfect device for a book, because it's a manageable number of players, 15 cards in a pack. And you get that randomness of it. You're kind of, you play the hand you're dealt. And I like that thrill of whoever's in this pack, those are the guys that I'm going with. So I resolved then to do this book project, and I had about 9 months to get ready for a road trip took the summer of 2015. And I also was fully cognizant of the fact that this was going to be just like with my PhD, this was the discovery approach. Like, I didn't know exactly what the whole story was going to be. I didn't have it all figured out. I didn't know what was in store for me. I didn't know that I would have a book to write, because again, I'm not some famous sports writer. I don't have any special connections. I didn't have a book deal. I mean, I'm a writer, but there was nothing that would guarantee me to have access to these players. But I did know, even at that early stage, that I wanted I wanted the book to have a lot of humanity to it, and then I wanted it to focus on these athletes as people and not just regurgitate the same baseball stories and statistics that you can read in any number of books or reference books or look up on the internet. So I set out, and I spent about 9 months doing a lot of basically stalking of these players by trying to find them across the country. And so it was a lot of writing. I wrote them each a letter, a snail mail letter, looking at public records databases to try to get in touch with them. And, I had to get really creative about how I found them. In some cases, it was easy. Like the guy Rance Mullenix, who played for the Blue Jays, he's a realtor now. So everyone knows the easiest person's phone number to ever get is a realtor. So you just go on Google and there's his cell phone number. Randy Reddy was complete serendipity. I was doing a Twitter search on him, and a tweet came up that was part of that email dump when hackers broke into Sony years ago and like exposed all these files, and somehow Randy Reddy's email ended up in that dump in that tweet. So I just found it there. Gary Templeton, I had a phone number through a public records search, and I called it, and it ended up being his daughter, but then his daughter put me in touch with him. So it was, just a lot of legwork. But I mapped out this journey that would take me across the country over the whole summer. And so in mid-June of 2015, I got into this vehicle, which I still drive to this day. It now has 258,000 miles on it, my 2002 Honda Accord, and set out on this journey by myself to try to find these players and kind of tell the story of what happened to them. And I'll just give you a few highlights, a couple of I'll just say that I didn't get to talk to every player. I had some failures, but actually I think those failures made the book better, because often the story of trying to get to a player was as interesting as getting to them and getting to talk to them. So just three stories here, three examples, and I put their card next to their picture of them when I met them. So Steve Yeager from the LA Dodgers, met him at his Jersey Mike's sub shop that he now runs in the San Fernando Valley in LA. And Yeager was known for being this really outspoken, kind of brash guy, big party guy back in the 70s and 80s. So I, foolishly assumed like, oh, this guy's going to be he's going to be a partier still. We're going to maybe go out and, do a bunch of whiskey shots or something. And turns out the guy hasn't had a drop of alcohol since 1986 or 87, because that actually was the year he retired. And he sunk into such a depression that he realized he needed to never drink again, for his own sake, his own health. And I got to spend a couple of days with Yeager and meet his son. And what made this road trip and then book so, I think, ultimately relatable was how vulnerable and open these guys were willing to be. So Steve Yeager, I'm a complete stranger to him, and yet he opened up to me about how his father was such an alcoholic that when he came to watch him play for the first time, he'd pass out in the clubhouse during the game. So seeing these guys share that and was just really remarkable to hear some of these stories. And there were lots of them, lots of examples of broken relationships with parents and struggles with addiction, and the transition out of being a professional athlete. Gary Templeton, another amazing story, met with him in San Diego, or San Marcos, near San Diego, where he lives, and got to hang out, talk to his wife, watch some baseball and some kung fu movies with him, because that's what he really likes to do, and revisit his days. And in that chapter, I talk about, and again, only because Tempe was so willing to open up about this whole incident in 1981 with his manager, Whitey Herzog. And you read that story and you realize how unfairly guys like Gary Templeton were treated because they were Black in that era in baseball, and what a role race played in, how much harder the Black players had to work to get the same attention that a lot of the white players did. And so, he shared the inside story behind that incident that really gives you new perspective on how Templeton was treated at the time, and how he should be viewed, or how it should have played out back then. And then the third example here is, this guy was my childhood hero, Don Carmen. Like I said before, I never liked the star players as much as the everyday guys, and so Don Carmen was my hero, and I got to meet him in Naples, Florida, and went to the zoo with him. And Carmen was just remarkable. His job now is he's the psychologist for Scott Boras, who's one of the most successful agents in baseball. And Carmen is such an intellectual, very thoughtful, working on his PhD in psychology. And again, like I was saying with Steve Yeager, surreal for me to spend time with my childhood hero, but then have him open up and share with me some of the trauma of his childhood in Western Oklahoma, growing up in this little town, basically in a really tough situation with a father that was abusive, and kind of telling me how that informed his career and his life. So that's just a few examples of the players that I met with. And I just thought I would, kind of give you a little bit of a sense of, because if you're a writer, everyone asks you, what is your book about? And I told you at the top, the straightforward answer, which is my book is about tracking down all the players in a pack of 1986 baseball cards, but that's not what it's really about. It's about bigger universal themes. And so the first one that I'll mention is what I would call won over the father-son relationship, or the inverse of the father-son relationship. We're used to thinking about the father-son relationship in baseball in this really tidy, picture-perfect way from Field of Dreams and Kevin Costner playing catch with his dad. And while there's plenty of that in my book, there's also the darker side, sort of the inverse of that, which is how many of these guys had really dysfunctional relationships with their fathers. Rick Sutcliffe, Randy Reddy, Don Carmen, Steve Yeager, Vince Coleman, Carlton Fisk, on and on. And how that affected them, again, as people. In some ways, it maybe made them better players or more motivated, but in the long run, that I think that takes a real toll to carry around that level of anger. So I talk a lot about, and that's something that, again, back to my whole construct of taking a discovery approach versus a hypothesis testing approach. I could never have anticipated that when I opened that pack of cards. I had no idea that the father-son relationship, or the inverse of it, would become a central theme in the book, because until you get on the road and do it, you don't know, what you're going to find. And sometimes that's how it is, and that's okay to not know, to go into it with the eyes wide open and discovery-based approach. The next theme is what I would say, and I've kind of given some quotes to support this theme, was but I just generally put in the bucket of non-duality, Zen, mental health, our relationship with fear, which is a big one, but there's a lot in my book about fear. And that's something every one of us on this call and in this world, all 8 billion of us, can relate to, is fear, because fear is really the opposite of love. It's the cause of most of the pain in the world. And it was interesting, again, not something I could have expected opening that pack, that in a way, this whole experience would turn out into a giant self-help book. in the book, I talk about my own dealing with OCD and that anxiety disorder, which is just a form of fear. Anxiety is fear. But what I didn't necessarily expect was how I call baseball players accidental Buddhists, because these guys that I met with ended up being really good at accepting the present and not being stuck in the past and dealing with their fear by accepting their fear. And in some ways that makes sense because, in baseball, there's so much failure that the only way you can be successful is knowing how to let go of the failure immediately and to not live in fear, right? But even after baseball, the way that they navigated their career, and most of these guys tended to be very well-adjusted, happy people now in their 50s and 60s. And I think a lot of that is because they knew how to let go of fear and to live in the present, and not let fear control their lives. And so, these are all things that these players said to me while I was meeting with them. Don Carmen admitting that his intensity as a player had come from fear. Steve Yeager saying, once it's gone, talking about the game of baseball and playing. And Gary Templeton, when I asked him about thinking about his playing days, he's like, you can't live in the past, you have to live in the present. So this notion of being present was a big theme, but also the other part of Zen Buddhism or Zen thought is non-duality, which is to say that two apparently contradictory things can be true at the same time, that it's okay that paradox is acceptable, because life is not black and white, it's shades of gray, or it's both black and white, if you want to say it that way. And so at the same time, while these players were in this place of great acceptance, they also do miss the game. And that's that non-duality. Lee Mazzilli said, when we get to a certain age, there are things we can't do, but in my mind, I still think I can do it. I think an athlete always has that competitive edge in him, always. You never lose that. And Rick Sutcliffe, as good as I have it now, nothing comes close to playing. Nothing ever will. Every time I watch a pitcher go to the mound to start a game and he takes that toe hold and digs that dirt out, right away I miss that. I'll never get to do that again. So again, these guys are content, and yet they still have, they still do miss the game and everything that comes with it. Two more themes are called the tortoise and the hare, which is the underdogs vindicated. This generally being that the players that were maybe less successful as baseball players tended to be more well-adjusted in their post-baseball lives. And also kind of circling back to the beginning of why it's a good idea, in my opinion, to take risks and sometimes take that discovery-based approach to solving problems and answering questions. I think the whole book is an endorsement for taking risks. So much so that the opening quote in my book is from Helen Keller, which I love, and it's, "Security is mostly a superstition. It does not exist in nature, nor do the children of men as a whole experience it. Avoiding danger is no safer in the long run than outright exposure. Life is a daring adventure or nothing." And kind of a corollary to that is Don Carmen, who said, "Anger and fear are not my motivators any longer. A big part of my philosophy is I don't get to write the script. Whatever it is, I just get to respond." I quote Viktor Frankl a lot to players, where he said, "The only true freedom we have is the freedom to choose how we respond to a given situation." And I love that because it gets at this notion that, your thoughts and your feelings and life circumstances and, all these things you have no control over, but you always do have control over how you respond. And that is the freedom that is the great freedom that we have, then with the choices we can make. So finally, it was kind of ironic that in the end, the book became an underdog itself. I gave you a peek into the journey, and then it ended up being that the book didn't come out till 2020 because it got rejected 38 times. and I cycled through two agents. I went back and saw the email from my second agent when he dumped me, who said, I think it sucks reaching the end of the road on any project, and I echo your frustration with my own. And so this book was kind of left for dead. But again, I never stopped believing in the story and in the story that these players had to share with me. And happy to say that in the end, the tortoise wins the race, and the book has done great. And I was really flattered when it was named one of NPR's best books of the year last year. So I think overall it's kind of, again, an endorsement for sticking to your guns and taking that riskier road and that discovery approach. So that's what I had prepared, and happy to go wherever from here.
Great. Thanks so much, Brad. Let me just sort of here. So I think you did a fantastic job, really, of illustrating, that depth that you were talking about that your book has, and that what one of the effects that it had on me. And we'll again get to questions that are there in the chat in just a second. Is that you obviously, that we're all familiar with the idea of baseball as a metaphor for life, that it's a marathon, it's not a sprint, and as you pointed out, that it's you fail more often than you succeed, and that there's a lot of metaphors for life lessons there. But I also think, and this is I think what's illustrated so well in your book, is that the lives of these particular baseball players and how they are making their way and finding their way in their lives is also, again, a metaphor. There's a lot of lessons there in terms of, not just in terms of their baseball careers and their success there, but in terms of their lives afterwards. And that I think there's a lot that I got out of their humbleness and their willingness to approach life in a different way. So what I wanted to ask you about is that what you've illustrated here is athletes as like three-dimensional individuals, more than just the statistics. And I'm thinking just in terms of like this moment that we're in right now, I'm curious what your thoughts are about athletes such as Naomi Osaka, Simone Biles, who have been bravely speaking out about their own struggles as human beings in terms of mental health and things like that. So how did that impact you? What were your thoughts as you were hearing some of these stories?
Yeah, I think I'm just always surprised at what I perceive as sort of the entitlement of fans and the masses. It's like, the fact that this is a story of that there's any pushback. I mean, if somebody is dealing with mental health issues or is struggling, nothing is more important than what's happening inside, winning an event or the Olympics or a World Series, it's all external. And so I think it's really selfish of people to criticize when an athlete or, someone who's competing, chooses to prioritize their own health over winning a medal or something. I'm always kind of like, wow, this shouldn't be as big of a deal as it is, or we should be talking about it in more widely as like, the fact that we're still so kind of behind on compassion for mental health is a problem. And I think, some of that is the culture within sports themselves can be very unforgiving about mental health. And I think we're seeing changes along those lines in many sports and in baseball even, which is very old fashioned. But Don Carmen is an example of that, of a guy whose job probably wouldn't have existed 20 years ago. And there's more and more athletes who are, speaking out about their own issues.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have some other questions and comments, but Bob, I want to turn it over in case if you have some questions or comments that came to you.
Yeah, yes, I do have a few here, Jeff, for Brad. One is from Jade, and she says, why did you select 1986 Topps? Particular connection to that year? During the 80s, there was an increase in card manufacturing companies. Why Topps over Fleer or Donruss?
Yeah, good question. Well, 86 was because that was the first year that I remember collecting. I was born in 1980. So I figured, well, if I have to choose a year, that's a good reason versus the second year I collected, the third year. And then Topps because so I grew up in a small town in Rhode Island called Greenville, and I went down to the Greenville pharmacy and they only really had Topps cards. So it's really because of the nostalgia and the connection to my childhood of what I had growing up.
And Jane has another question. She says, the last 18 months has seen a large rise in trading card popularity. Brad's book was released in April 2020 at the start of the pandemic. Looking back at the timing of his publishing calendar, does he feel renewed interest in collecting has benefited his sales? And how does that feeling compare to his initial thoughts when he realized COVID was going to have a major disruption in our lives? And was he initially concerned how that might impact the initial release of the book?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of this is at scale. Like COVID is much bigger deal than anyone's book, right? So I never thought that anything to do with my book is as important as people being healthy and dealing with COVID. But sure, from a professional perspective, it was a blow. I had a 35 stop book tour that was canceled that I had spent much of the spring setting up. At the same time, people being home a lot and not having baseball to watch may have benefited the book as something that people could have some content with. And Jane's got a great point about the complete resurgence of the card collecting industry. And I was actually just at the National Sports Collectors Convention in Chicago a couple of weeks ago, and was so blown away by how big it is and how different it is than when I was collecting in the 80s, that I'm actually writing a story about that sort of the experience of going there as a lapsed collector. And I think that in some ways, Jane, it's helped my book, maybe not enormously, but it's, just having cards in the zeitgeist has probably helped my book. But at the same time, it may have hurt my book too, in the sense that, or I should say, I wouldn't necessarily assume that all collectors are going to love my book, because a lot of collectors are diehard baseball purists. And it's been interesting that there's a small but vocal minority of people who leave reviews and have made comments that I've seen on Amazon and elsewhere that really don't like me or my book. And they seem to get, very offended by the fact that my book is so personal. And it's been an interesting thing to unpack for me as a writer, as a person. You write a book and my book is very personal, so I can't help but have my feelings hurt. But I kind of think that the reason why is because my book is kind of like holding up a mirror. And especially for a lot of, I think, men of that wax pack generation, older, the guys in their 50s, 60s, 70s, my book kind of forced you to think about your relationships with your own kids and your own dad. And if those weren't good relationships, or if you're not comfortable being vulnerable emotionally, my book can make you feel really uncomfortable. So my observation is that I think that those are often the people that don't like it as much. So I try to be very honest about what my book is and what my book isn't.
This question's from Steve. Do you think if you had met 1976 or 1996 players, your conclusions or the book would have been similar or dissimilar?
I think 76 would have been similar. I think 96 would have been getting different. This is a great question. I've thought about it. And then, of course, I think about it with today's players. And I think there's a lot of differences, especially now, if I wrote about today's players 30 years from now. One of them being that one of the main differences is that these guys in this era, the world was not connected the way it is now. And so most of these guys, like Don Carmen grows up in a small town in Oklahoma, and he didn't even know where Philadelphia was when they signed him. So the game was actually kind of less friendly back then because guys didn't know each other growing up. Now, baseball players often know each other from they only play baseball in their childhood, and they go on these traveling teams, and they kind of know each other before they get to, I mean, this is at least the American players, they've already known each other before they get to Major League Baseball. So the culture is very different, I think, now than it was back then.
And one more question here, Jeff. This is from Emlyn. Brad, can you speak to your personal journey in the book?
Yeah, well, my personal journey is kind of threaded throughout the book. And, for me, here I was 34 years old, interestingly, the same age that most of these guys were when they retired from playing baseball. And so I kind of use that as a device for my own self-exploration in the book of, okay, I'm in my mid 30s, and, I'm not where I thought I would be. I thought I'd be married with kids, and then, not doing that. And what can I learn from these players who had their own transition point when they were at this age, when they could no longer play baseball? And on my journey, I went back and met up with a ex-girlfriend that I hadn't seen in almost 10 years, and kind of got some closure there. And I talk about my battle with OCD, and how that relates to, again, how we interact with fear in our lives and anxiety. And I think by and large, I didn't have any, giant epiphany, but I think getting to know these players, well, I say the thing that I really took out of it, getting to know these players, was how much more we have in common with them than we ever realized. And that was something I didn't, again, necessarily expect when I started out.
So again, if anybody else has any questions, feel free to type those in the chat or raise your hand, and we can have you unmute. Getting back to baseball cards and baseball card collecting, and again, as you pointed out, the book is obviously much deeper than that. What do you think though about, like, I remember my experience as a kid collecting baseball cards, and what is it? And again, I'm wondering, as your career as a scientist, if there's some relation to, like, they're organized and they're numbered and there's a complete set to put together. What is it that's so enticing for us, especially as kids, to collect baseball cards?
Yeah, I think there's something, as I was saying in my talk, that to me, like, studying the insects and the baseball players, there's a similarity there. There's, like, putting them under the microscope, and really, I think with baseball cards, there's something discrete and tangible about the actual card that, to an OCD type brain like mine, or someone who just really has that very detail oriented brain, there's something very satisfying about all the ways that you could organize baseball cards, or all the information you had crammed into the back of them. It was, for me, the backs were more interesting than the fronts, and looking at all the information there. So I think that there's something about the collector mindset that is a way to kind of find order and comfort in the world, whether you're collecting baseball cards or naming insects or collecting antiques or whatever it is. I think it's kind of a bit of a catharsis or an escape.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm just going to make a little side note here. Last summer, we had the docent from the Metropolitan Museum of Art give a talk for the library on the Mets antique baseball card collection. It's a really interesting talk. There's lots of great photos of them. It's also on our YouTube page. So for those who want to take a deep dive into, like, the very origins of baseball cards, and tobacco cards really is what they were then, included with a pack of cigarettes. Definitely check that out. I think for those who are real fans of the baseball cards themselves, you'll learn a lot. So one other thing I wanted to maybe sort of circle back around to, Brad, is that, and it's something that um, sort of conclude towards the end of your book. I don't think this is sort of giving anything away, but your concept of who your childhood heroes were of baseball players, in terms of how this journey of this that you took in this book brought you to sort of a new conclusion in terms of who is a hero and somebody that you look up to. So I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think I like, after taking the trip and doing the book, I idolize these guys less, but respect them more. And to me, that's a healthy way to view. I mean, it's a healthy way to view this notion of heroes as an adult. As a kid, they're supposed to be superheroes, and that's the simplicity of being a kid and the thrill of it, right? But to me, it can be problematic when people basically are still looking at these people as that they are a kid, in that they're putting them on too much of a pedestal, or they're having way too high expectations of them in terms of their performance. Or again, I talk about how relatable players seem. Now when I watch a game and I see an athlete make a mistake and people booing them, it just really bothers me, because it's not that just because they make a lot of money doesn't mean that we're entitled to be jerks and treat them poorly, right? Because if librarians, Jeff, were paid $20 million a year, you would not say no to a $20 million salary. It's the market of your job, right? So this whole idea of like, oh, well, they're all rich and they all, I can say I pay my $30, I can say whatever I want to them. Like, I just don't think that flies. I know I wouldn't feel good if I was at my computer and I had someone over my shoulder yelling at me at how much I sucked as a writer. So, why do we do that? And these guys, they hear everything. They act like they don't hear the boos and the heckles, but they hear it all. And no one wants to be called those things or booed. So he's kind of gave me a new perspective on the relationship of fans and players.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I think, there was some commentary on, just as the Olympics were winding down, I think particularly in terms of like the current status of youth sports, and that so much of it is hyper competitive. And there was some new statistics that I think that 70% of kids are dropping out of youth sports around the age of 13, because there's so much of that pressure to succeed, because it's going to look good on your college resume and things like that, as opposed to just enjoying the sport, being part of a team, and things like that. So I think I appreciate you sort of pointing out some of the unfair dynamic there that goes on between fans and players. So Bob, I just want to check, just in case anybody else put anything in the chat, or if anybody else has any questions, just go ahead and raise your hand.
Nothing so far, Jeff.
Okay. One last thing I just wanted to mention. I don't know if you're familiar with the book, The Glory of Their Times, by Lawrence Ritter. So your book made me think of it because, again, Lawrence Ritter, he took his son on the road and did this journey across the country. I'm thinking this was late 60s, early 70s. And for those who aren't familiar with the book, his intention was to go interview all these ball players who were at the very late stages of their lives and had really never had their stories told. And in the process of his journey, you really find out something else about them as well, way beyond just what their baseball careers were, and even what their baseball careers were like in terms of taking trains from place to place and really being looked at as like the fringes of society in terms of people who played baseball for a job. So I'm wondering if you can share with us what was was there sort of an epiphany or a moment where you realized, because you took this discovery approach with your book, that this is what I'm after here, and you know, and finding some of those examples. Is there something along those lines?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the discovery approach, really what that really just means is learning how to be a good observer, which is actually what makes you a good scientist. I mean, learning how to listen and watch and observe and be open to what's in front of you. And so, yeah, as I got on the trip and started talking to people, I started to realize, again, this notion of like, like the father-son relationship is just this wonderful thing in baseball. There's the other side of that. And I actually ended up bringing my own dad on the road with me for a little bit. And I have a good relationship with my dad, but, I think everyone has some issues with their family members. And so I, talk about some of those roadblocks and kind of explore that. And so it was nice because the things that I was discovering as I went gave me an opportunity to kind of reflect and bring in my own experiences where they were relevant. And I think that's what the book does when you read it, is you can't help but think about your own life and your own relationships and like, well, what am I doing in my relationships? So I think, in that sense, it engages the reader in a way that if I had just gone out and, with a sort of a one idea in my head about this is what I'm going to find or what I'm going to look for, I would have missed it.